Just a quick note before we start the video. I want to try my best to avoid being age restricted, since that's basically algorithm poison, so I'm going to have to tiptoe around certain words and ask you to use context to figure out what I mean. I know this sounds ridiculous, but it also relates to this video and how platforms like YouTube regulate their content in line with America's sanitized view of what's acceptable and the financial interests, namely advertisers that determine what you see and what you should hear. Anyway, let's start. Okay, so I'm going to assume that most of the people watching this have at least watched one superhero movie before, or perhaps a Star Wars movie. If there's any theme that unites these movies, other than being intensely mediocre and predictable, it's violent conflict. I mean, war is literally in the title of these movies. These movies usually start out with almost everything being calm, then very quickly they're presented with a threat, usually an antagonist and their numerous subordinates. Throughout the movies, there will be a good amount of fighting, usually some small skirmishes to punctuate the moments between plot development. The good guys and the bad guys will enter an all-out war where the hero or heroes of our film will face insurmountable odds in a 30 to 40 minute blandly edited CG-filled spectacle of a fight against hordes of enemies. With Star Wars, it's usually against the stormtroopers, and in Marvel movies, it's nameless, impossible to remember aliens or robots, since Disney isn't too keen on blood being spilled. After 2.5 hours of watching a movie that they've basically seen many times before this, the audience gets up from their theatre seat and for some weird reason applauds at a large theatre screen. Then they go home to talk about how amazing the fights were with friends and reply to posts on Reddit. Whilst these movies aren't particularly gory or gratuitous, they are ultimately violent, since they contain combat, and sometimes people being killed by other people. It also happens to be the case where violence is the main selling point of these movies. Yes, the story, characters, and dialogue all play a role in making these movies what they are, but they're sold on the back of the spectacle of violence, hence why you see so much of it in their trailers and why so much of its runtime is dedicated to it. Now, you could respond to this by saying, well, wouldn't these movies be pretty bland if they didn't have these scenes? And to an extent, you would be correct. These movies are designed to be a thrill ride, and part of that spectacle is the warfare. But I want to ask, why is it that we see violence as a spectacle? That it's something to be celebrated? The real world isn't devoid of conflict, far from it. There are wars happening seemingly all the time, and violent crimes are happening somewhere in the world practically every hour of the day. But very few of us actually condone it. I'd go as far as to say that the majority of people are disgusted by it. When people resort to violence, it's seen as a failure of diplomacy, an inability to reach a consensus, or at least part ways with each other, and reject your base instinct to respond by being angry and hurting someone physically. We avoid violence, yet in our movies, TV shows, and video games, we see it constantly, and it largely exists to be celebrated. Despite this though, violence is still a part of our reality, whether it's individuals getting into fistfights, fatal attacks, or something on a greater scale like war, with or without instigation. And regardless of civilization's growth, there are plenty of people in the world who still see violence as the default and necessary reaction to opposition. I also want to get this out of the way as early as possible and say that if you are someone who consumes and enjoys violent media, I am not admonishing you personally, and to an extent, I'm not being critical of the people who create it. What I want to do is explore what happened to make it so that violence became normalized and celebrated culturally, both in our media and real life, especially in America. I want to explore how America's history of violence influenced its attitudes towards conflict, how the country was born in the fires of conflict, and why its citizens and politicians believe that taking another human being's life is a valid response in order to preserve their freedom or property, how those attitudes have led to the creation of media that glorifies violence above all else, and how for many, in the face of conflict, diplomacy, tolerance, and even love are not only rejected but maligned and seen as a weakness. Let's take a look at how America loves to hate and hates to love.
I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it.
If we're to understand how violence has played such a pivotal role in America's culture over the years, we have to look at how the country has utilized it throughout its history. Now, if we were to touch upon every historically significant moment of violent conflict in America, this video would be hours long, since despite being a country that's basically in its infancy compared to many other countries around the world, its history and its relationship with violence has been consistent throughout its very few hundred years of existence. It's impossible to ignore the fact that America was a country that was founded on violence, after European colonists believed that they were the first to discover the country, and they did so with the intention of establishing colonies, defeating natives who opposed them, and imposing their way of life upon those who didn't want it. The white colonizers who wanted to claim America for themselves believed that the natives were savages, untamed, and didn't have a place in their idea of civilization. As such, the US government ordered over 1,500 wars, attacks, and raids on the native population, the most that any country in the world had orchestrated against a native population. By the 19th century, the indigenous population had dwindled down to an estimated 238,000, a far cry from the estimated 5 to 15 million living in North America when Christopher Columbus first arrived at their shores. As time progressed, fear still festered in the hearts of Americans. They fought against the British in the American Revolution to gain their independence. The desire for independence wasn't unanimous though. In fact, only 1/3 of Americans said that they wanted it, another third said that they were against the idea, and the last third was uncertain. But the people who feared were the most loudest, and it resulted in a long and bloody war. Eventually, the Declaration of Independence was signed, which included the Second Amendment, granting Americans the right to bear arms. At the time, it made at least some sense. There was little to no organization in place which would come to protect citizens should they be victimized, so it allowed them some form of self-defense. And although many Americans to this day cite the Second Amendment to claim that their forefathers had the infinite wisdom to allow them to possess firearms to defend themselves, I doubt that the people in 1776 accounted for the creation of the assault rifle or any other weapon that could fit in a child's hands and slaughter a room of people in less than 1 minute. It's also worth mentioning that only white Americans were allowed to own firearms during this time. As such, if any slaves were to decide that they wanted to turn against their owner, they'd be at a disadvantage against all those who opposed them. Skipping ahead, whites in America remained constantly afraid of the other, and opposed those who fought to gain more rights, especially black people. There was intense opposition to the civil rights movements, and various figures within the media and political realm spoke out against it. America also had a tendency to hold on to its more traditional values. It placed family values above all else, and parents alongside the church were to instill a moral framework based around Christian teachings upon young and impressionable minds who would go on to become righteous, traditional members of society who shunned anything that was outside of the status quo, which just happened to exclude people of color and LGBTQ people who were considered a threat to the moral fabric of America, and to many Americans they still are. And it's often the case where conservative parents use their children's innocent mind as a shield for their own ignorance, usually with statements like, "How am I supposed to explain it to my child when they see two men kissing on television?" Gee, I don't know, Deborah. If you struggle so much to explain what a gay person is, maybe you should reconsider how qualified you are to be a parent to a child. I don't think it's very fair to ask queer people to stop existing just because you can't sit down for 2 minutes and explain that sometimes people of the same gender are attracted to each other to Jackson, who you doomed to a life of constantly having to tell people that their name is inexplicably spelled with 2 X's and a Y. It is a very flimsy defense, and it insists that tradition must be preserved both outside and inside of the family unit, regardless of individual thoughts and feelings. And to this day, people of color and LGBTQ people are at far greater risk of being attacked or persecuted than cis hetero people, simply for being in a society that contains people who reject them for who they are. Outside of American soil, the United States military has been involved in wars almost constantly after World War II. Barely a year has gone by where they haven't instigated or have some kind of involvement in a conflict. Overall, they've been involved in 28 wars since 1950, mostly in South and Central America and the Middle East, often with the intention of imposing their interpretation of a civilized country upon them. But history has taught us that their true intentions was to destabilize communist societies in order to secure capitalism as an unchallenged ideology in the world, or to secure valuable commodities such as oil or minerals. Throughout the years, many Americans have voiced their opinions against certain conflicts, especially the Vietnam War, which mostly underprivileged Americans were conscripted into fighting due to the draft, whereas more privileged ones managed to dodge it. This was during the Cold War, and the Red Scare was in full swing. The American government was afraid that communist regimes would cause a domino effect and spread into bordering countries, and many citizens at the time didn't believe that it was right to say how another country should be run. Vietnam also happened to be the first heavily televised and visually publicized war. Televisions, cameras, and other media equipment were relatively cheap and accessible, and news reporters were given access to report what's happening. All of this exposed to the world the atrocities occurring in this conflict and further cemented their opposition. Meanwhile, as this was happening, the government was going to great lengths to justify America's involvement, and although some did, it was in essence a PR nightmare that they couldn't recover from. Throughout the Cold War though, things started to change, and the US government leaned hard into encouraging patriotism into Americans by instilling fear of the other and painting a black and white view of the world, where the US is inherently good, and any decision to enter a conflict was out of a desire to defeat evil. After the Cold War, it was believed that the last great enemy had been defeated after the dissolution of the USSR, and political scientists such as Francis Fukuyama declared that this was the end of history. Yeah, turns out it was wrong, and since the attack on the Twin Towers was such a momentous event that happened on American soil, Americans universally felt unsafe, and they felt hostility towards the other, namely Middle Eastern people and Muslims. They were intensely maligned as a result of all this. Although the US government has played a major role in establishing that force and violence is an acceptable response to any opposition, whether that be ideological or an attack, it's hard to ignore the other, arguably more significant influence on how Americans view violence and how it should be used, and that is the media, including news, television, movies, and to some extent, music. With movies and TV in particular, Americans have been spoon-fed on a steady diet of patriotism and the acceptance and normalization of violence. They don't have to be necessarily jingoistic like many of the action movies produced in the 80s or the many Islamophobic products that were created in the 2000s. They can simply be created with the intention of violence and conflict being the main selling point. Hollywood is one of the biggest and most successful movie industries in the world, and although it's created its fair share of films that are devoid of violence, it's safe to say that studios have been able to pull in billions of dollars, largely thanks to action movies. Although Steven Spielberg's Jaws was considered the first blockbuster movie, even though... Wait, what's happening? Is that a royalty-free version of the Jaws theme? Well, that can only mean one thing. It's time for a word from this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. In this day and age, it's always worth being protected when you're online. There are plenty of people who can steal your private data or monitor your activity, and using a VPN can stop that from happening, whether it's from hackers or even your ISP. Surfshark VPN helps you keep your connection secured by routing your connection through private servers while being extremely easy to use and maintaining a fast connection. One feature of Surfshark VPN that I and many others love is that it can also unlock parts of the internet that aren't available to you in your country. There are plenty of shows and movies on services like Netflix that are only available in certain countries, and Surfshark allows you to watch them. You can use one subscription across various devices too, including Android and iOS, so if you're using an Oppo Wi-Fi connection, it can keep you protected there. If you visit a link below and use the promo code Salari, you can get an 83% discount on the usual price and 4 months extra for free. If you're somehow not completely satisfied, then they also have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Surf the web safely today. Link in the description. So, anyway. Even though Jaws was a surprising success, it was George Lucas's Star Wars that was the godfather of the modern blockbuster film and created the blueprint for many of the big budget movies that are almost constantly in cinemas today. It established this idea of grand skirmishes between good and evil, the small scrappy heroes against insurmountable odds, and although such conflicts are won through being smart, being powerful is also important in these stories. This isn't to say that the conflicts in these movies aren't justified, but it's interesting how conflict and violence, even if they are relatively tame, are the main selling points of these movies. A serviceable story along with believable and decently written characters are also important. After all, there are plenty of action movies out there that lack both and result in a product that feels hollow. But these are aspects that arguably are just a small part that enhances the main course, like picking the right wine or side dish to pair it with your meal. It helps audiences get emotionally invested in these conflicts and justifies their inclusion, but it isn't the unique selling point. There's a reason why blockbuster movies climax with combat. It's the payoff that audiences receive for investing their attention in the plot. But even then, there are people who watch these movies and don't give a damn about the story. They just want to watch punching, shooting, and a whole bunch of explosions. I mean, how else would you explain the success of the Transformers movies? Come on. You might be asking, what's wrong with audiences wanting spectacle, and what could possibly replace what they are now? Firstly, there's nothing inherently wrong with movies that contain violence or conflict. Movies are art, and they're useful for contextualizing and interpreting our lives through a different lens. Violence is an unfortunate but undeniable part of our lives, whether it's experiencing it firsthand or witnessing it. So it's fair that it's represented through art. As for what we could replace it with that would satisfy audiences just as much, honestly, I don't have the answer for that. While there is no shortage of media that is a visual feast for the eyes that most definitely qualifies as spectacle, they have nowhere near the mass appeal of something like a Star Wars movie or Marvel movie, and blockbuster movies have become so reliant on the good versus evil formula that anything outside of that has become a hard sell to audiences. Not all violence in American cinema exists to be celebrated though. The horror genre has been known to contain plenty of violence in various forms, and can be far more gory and explicit than anything you'd see in a blockbuster movie. Although in recent years the genre has been toned down a bit since movie studios realized that they were missing out on sales from a teenage audience, so a lot of what we see these days are bland, predictable PG-13 movies filled with jump scares and usually some doll or ghost or whatever antagonist can sustain a franchise. Horror movies are arguably a condemnation of violence rather than something to be celebrated. Horror movies are designed to make audiences feel uncomfortable and tense, and although this can be achieved through various methods, one of the more commonly used ones is via varying levels of violence, whether it's implied or gratuitous. Many modern horror movies will have a more sanitized approach to violence to achieve their aforementioned PG-13 rating, but there have been plenty of horror movies where the gore is incredibly explicit. Two notable examples in recent years have been the Hostel movies, directed by Eli Roth, and the incredibly successful Saw franchise, which has had 8 entries, 9 if you include Spiral. However, even though horror movies contain violence of varying degrees and they're more often than not designed to repulse the viewer, it's still the selling point behind the movie. Media is supposed to elicit emotions in the audience, and horror movies are intent on making you feel uneasy. Therefore, their violence is still a celebration. One movie that I want to mention that was a subversion of the horror genre was German director Michael Haneke's Funny Games, first released in German language in 1997 and remade in English in 2007. Without getting too far into the plot, Funny Games is based around a family of 3 who are visiting their vacation home and are held captive by 2 sadistic young men who, without motivation, threaten to kill them if they don't win their series of games over a 24-hour period. Haneke created the film to toy with expectations of the audiences, specifically American ones. He said, "When I first envisioned Funny Games in the mid-1990s, it was my intention to have an American audience watch the movie. It is a reaction to a certain American cinema, its violence, its naivety, the way American cinema toys with human beings. In many American films, violence is made consumable." Haneke masterfully succeeds in this endeavor. The antagonist's absence of justification behind what they're doing is frustrating. They blatantly look into the camera and address the audience, essentially asking them whether they're satisfied with the senseless violence that they're giving them. And the film has an intentionally unsatisfying resolution. The most provocative thing that the film does, though, is that when its most grisly violence is occurring, it doesn't show you it. It leaves you to wonder what's happening, and by extension is meant to make you question, why do I want to see or know what's happening? Funny Games is an exceptional movie that is successful in its endeavors in every way, and I highly recommend that you watch it. It's also a rarity in that the remake is actually better than the original. I strongly suggest that you watch it, but I do have to warn you that it is a deeply unsettling movie, so maybe look up a content guide before you do. One interesting aspect is what movie studios and TV networks deem acceptable for consumption for audiences, and how intimacy and portrayals of the human body are more heavily scrutinized by regulators and ratings boards, whereas violence and gore are given far more concessions. It fits neatly into the idea that audiences, especially American ones, think that violence and gore are more acceptable for audiences to see, whereas intimacy is required to mostly remain implied. Also, remember at the beginning when I said that you're going to want to use some context clues? You're going to want to do that with the word intimacy here, because YouTube ain't a fan of that other word. The Motion Picture Association of America, or MPAA, is responsible for giving ratings to movies, and even though they do have their rules, albeit very vague ones that can change from person to person, they tend to be far more lenient towards portrayals of violence in movies than they are with intimacy. Movies with intense violence, such as Taken, have managed to get a PG-13 rating, but movies with extreme, persistent, or realistic portrayals receive an R rating. Even if it's borderline comical, such as a movie like Kill Bill Volume 1 and its absurd amount of blood and gore. Fun fact, that fight against the Crazy 88 was supposed to be in color, but the ridiculous amount of blood was going to give it an NC-17 rating, so they changed it to a Kurosawa-style black and white. As for portrayals of sex, well, they have no guidelines, and this is where the more puritanical values come into play. Nudity has some guidelines, like if it's a brief and non-sexual moment, a movie can receive a PG-13 rating, but as for portrayals of intimacy, the line between receiving a PG-13 R and NC-17 rating can be blurry. But historically, the MPAA has been far more willing to give an R rating or above to movies that contain portrayals of intimacy. The MPAA gives the most leeway to intimacy within more traditional contexts. So if you want a PG-13 but need to include an intimate scene, it should be between a straight couple in a relationship with no nudity, and it also has to be in the missionary position. If it's in a different position between people of the same gender, or if it involves multiple partners or a one-night stand, it's an immediate R rating or above. Also, be sure to keep the scene as short as possible. Studios see an NC-17 rating as the kiss of death, since it restricts younger audiences from watching in the theatre and thus jeopardizes ticket sales. Major studios have become more averse to R ratings in recent years too, which has led to some filmmakers pleading with them to allow them to create movies that aren't burdened by the need to sanitize for audiences. Bear in mind, the MPAA is representative of the major film studios in the US, including Disney, which has had a long history of releasing family-friendly movies devoid of any controversial content, and played a huge role in shaping American censorship. Although apparently they don't seem to be bothered about controversy when it comes to where they shoot their movies. Censorship on network television in the US shares many similarities with the film industry, and even though they have more solid guidelines, it's arguably far more restrictive and puritanical in some respects, especially when it comes to intimacy and portrayals of bodies. I feel so stupid tiptoeing around these words. Nudity and intimacy is completely prohibited on network television, regardless of the time of day, whereas violence and even gore is permitted to some extent. But there's been some surprisingly graphic portrayals over the recent years. There was a scene in the show Hannibal that served as an interesting example of censorship standards on network television, and once again, I can't be too descriptive about this thanks to you-know-who. An incredibly graphic murder took place where organs were removed from two nude victims and suspended in the air to resemble angel wings while they were posed in a kneeling position at the end of the bed. Despite being a shocking and gory scene, the censors didn't take issue with that. However, they did take issue with the fact that the corpse's butt cracks were too visible, so they had to tone that down in post-production. Everything else though, A-okay. The FCC ultimately oversees the content allowed on network television, but premium cable channels like HBO aren't, hence why it has more wieners than a German restaurant. Believe it or not, basic cable channels also aren't subject to these rules. However, one major distinction between premium and basic cable is that basic is funded by advertisers, and many networks refuse to allow more graphic portrayals of intimacy out of fear of them pulling out. Okay, I know how that sounded, but I didn't mean it. As you might be aware, I like to put aside a moment to promote smaller creators in each video, so if you'll indulge me for a moment and hop on the Boost Bus, a name which a bunch of you apparently loved in the last video, so I guess I'm stuck with it. Thanks. I only have myself to blame, I guess, but thanks nonetheless. This time I want to show you the work of Katie Russell. She works as an environmentalist in Canada, and she's also an artist that works mostly with watercolors and incorporates Copic markers, pen and ink. As you can see, she has an emphasis on nature in her paintings, with some elements of fantasy thrown in. I was blown away by how gorgeous Katie's paintings are when I first saw them. The clean line work, the shading and use of natural colors make every piece outstanding. You can follow Katie and see more of her art on Instagram at @small_dove and on Twitter at @small_dove_art. She's also accepting commissions if you would like some of her amazing work, so please offer your support in any way that you can. It really does mean a lot to small creators. If you'd like a ride on the Boost Bus, I hate that name, then please email me at salarivideo@gmail.com and tell me about yourself and what you do. Be sure to include a good amount of samples of your work, a short bio, and your pronouns along with your socials. Also, please send only one email. I can't reply to them all, but rest assured that they are being read. Anyway, back to the video. In recent months, you may have heard about the controversy around OnlyFans, a website which was created with the intention of people supporting content creators of various types in exchange for content. It's kind of like Patreon, but with different pricing structures. But the site quickly became a platform in which sex workers could distribute their content. Back in August of this year, they made the announcement that they will be banning and removing explicit content, which was a shocking move given that at this point, OnlyFans have become predominantly known for hosting such content, more so than anything else. The reason behind this was, much like movies and TV networks, because of money. CEO of OnlyFans Tim Stokely claimed that various banks withdrew funding from the site. They were also allegedly struggling to find more funding due to their content, and financiers didn't want the association with that. Despite the fact that the sex industry brings in ludicrous amounts of money every year, there is still an intense stigma against it, and when it comes to financial interests, including advertisers, many entities and corporations are adamant about adhering to family-friendly and traditional values. And at the end of the day, they have the final say in what kind of content can and can't be published, whether it's on OnlyFans, movie screens, TV, or even right here on YouTube. The people that fund the creation of content aren't interested in being provocative. They want producers to create things that will give them the highest return on investment possible, and as such that means creating a product that has broad appeal and stays within the bounds of the sensibilities of the public. Now, of course, this isn't to say that this is a purely American thing. Lots of countries around the world have a similar stance to their media. Some are far more looser, some are stricter. For example, with Japan, video games are less restrictive when it comes to sexually suggestive imagery, but they are more stricter when it comes to depictions of violence. A lot of gamers think that Japan is like an artistic refuge from Western censorship, and there are even entire YouTube channels and Twitter accounts highlighting how Western versions of video games were censored, but it happens both ways. Japan is a fairly conservative country. In fact, they really don't like gore in their video games, and they do actually cut out quite a bit of suggestive imagery as well, so sorry gamers. There's been this notion in recent years, notably after the Gamergate movement, that feminists and various other progressive groups are going out of their way to pressure media producers into removing or censoring sexually suggestive content, but this is simply not true. Given all the sexual harassment allegations that have happened in the past couple of years, I think it's fairly safe to say that being progressive isn't exactly high on the agenda when it comes to a lot of publishers and developers, regardless of how their promotional videos may make them look like they are. Speaking of video games, they're another medium that's also heavily reliant on violence. Virtually every AAA title contains combat in some form or other, and it's only really sports games that are both successful and devoid of violence. There are plenty of titles that don't rely on combat though, notably within the indie market, and publishers are paying attention to the fact that gamers do want a non-violent, laid-back experience. Animal Crossing New Horizons for the Nintendo Switch was wildly successful, and none of its mechanics are based around combat, unless you include hitting Gulliver with a net. Oh my god, stop talking and wake up, you piece of shit. So what should we do here? Am I saying that we should remove violence from our media and replace it with more lewd content? Of course not. Like I said, violence and its depictions does have its place in the media, and it would be immature to suggest otherwise. Do we need more intimacy? No, not really. I think we've all had our fair share of situations where you sit down to watch a show with your family members and suddenly you're all sat there pretending that you're not watching two actors pretending to perform the no pants dance, and personally I don't want to increase the chances of that happening. I do, however, think that the institutions that decide what should and shouldn't be seen or spoken about in our media are unfairly imposing traditional American values on the US, and by extent the world. And their pursuit of mass market appeal is denying us of media that can normalize love in its various forms, and reinforces the notion that violence is to be celebrated more than it. Come to think of it, you could also argue that the reason why we're so uncomfortable watching love scenes in front of others is because we've been conditioned to do so, very effectively as well. It's telling that you can watch a violent scene with your family and none of you will bat an eyelid, but as soon as things start to get hot and heavy, you'll whip out your phone to look at your socials until it's over, or conveniently need to go to the bathroom. We know you didn't need to go. There's no splashing. Even here on YouTube, content creators are subject to ridiculous and vague rules which determine whether a video is suitable for advertisers, hence why I've had to walk on eggshells with certain words during this video, and I've had to do it in the past as well. My video on loneliness in Japan was my first breakthrough on this platform and was performing extremely well until YouTube decided that my delicately handled discussion on mental health in Japan wasn't going to be okay with advertisers, so they flagged it, and next thing you know, all of its momentum came to a crashing halt. It went from receiving around 20,000 views a day to less than 100. So yeah, forgive me if I'm a little cautious when it comes to using certain language. Forgive me for including sponsorships, and forgive me for asking for support on Patreon, but every video is a house of cards that can crumbling down at any second, and if I'm to do this for a living, I and many other creators need income to fall back on. American values are, to be frank, garbage, and in many ways hypocritical. It's ironic that the country that has such a prudish approach to censorship also happens to be the largest producer of adult movies in the world. It's ridiculous that studios like Disney are congratulated for being progressive by including brief scenes with same-sex relationships, but they're usually just a fleeting moment that's barely noticeable unless you look for it and totally insignificant to the plot. And that's so that they can easily cut them out to pander to homophobic foreign audiences. American culture has long established the importance of violence in society, and that idea has bled into our media for too long, and in our ideologies too. There are so many stories to be told that don't involve conflict, but instead we just keep seeing movies and TV shows that cater to our caveman instincts to get enjoyment from hitting things. But we're an evolved species, we're capable of speech and communication. Violence is the failure of diplomacy, and much of our media teaches us that diplomacy isn't worth the effort. Look at a movie like Marvel's Civil War. Without getting into the plot too much, the dispute between Captain America and Iron Man could have most definitely been resolved had they sat down and spoke about it. I know that media is escapism, and I know that children and adults aren't going to watch a movie or play a video game and try to repeat what they see on the screen. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that that is not an issue. I just think that we can do better, and because America as a country places so much value on violence, its spectacle and its utility above all else, both culturally and politically, it's not right that in the process, love should be seen as abnormal or even a weakness. Just look at how many Americans think that war should be the core of the country's foreign policy. Not to sound too cheesy, but love is a powerful force. It doesn't necessarily have to be made into entertainment, but the more we promote violence in our lives and our stories, the more we underestimate and undervalue love. Well, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all of that stuff. It does really help out. I hate asking for it, but it's necessary. I would also like to thank the patrons that help support these videos. As you can see, they're scrolling up here right now. They're all wonderful people that chip in a little bit each month. And I would also like to give a special shout out to all of the patrons that donate $5 or more each month. And that goes out to Anne-Marie Hanyasova, Freeman Killer, Lizzie Peasy, Insula Sacra, Paulius Jonases, Grant B, Jay, Jordan Christoph, Matthew Torres, Rach, Eleanor, Enrique Gutierrez, Eric Espinoza, Nathan Frerin, Murger Fashionable, Alina, Hello It's Leo, Hello, Jay's Reviews, Ratums, Mandy Sprector, Games, Martina, Sanderpanda, Ashton the Platypus, CB Hart, Kevin Korber, Logan Roan, Sharfay, Nostracon, Lexi Weiss, Mariam, Mickey Bonadonna, Floof Pants, Tamara, Neve Mitchell, Marius Stubberud, Your Sweet Pea, Catherine, and Steve Marr. Thank you all so much for supporting me. It really does mean a lot to me. And if you would like to support the channel too and help me keep the lights on, you can do so at patreon.com/Salari. Even $1 goes a very long way with something like this. So yeah, any help that you could offer is fine. But if you can't do, I appreciate you watching nonetheless. You can also follow me on Twitter at SalariTV. I barely have any followers, probably because I never post anything on there, but yeah, whatever, go follow me. But yeah, Also, I have the Patreon question of the video, and this time it comes from Steve Marr. Steve asks, which game am I looking forward to in this fall season? I'm very much looking forward to Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker, the new expansion. I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV tons recently, and I cannot wait to get more story content since I've finished all the expansion stuff. Plus, I'm looking forward to playing the new healer class, the Sage. But yeah, go play Final Fantasy XIV, World of Warcraft players, because Activision Blizzard is a terrible company. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching and supporting me. It does mean the world to me. I know I sound like a broken record at this point by repeating this, but I do genuinely mean it. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I will see you next time, okay? Bye-bye.